You used to get a lot of game for nothing. I think it's hard to convey to people who weren't there for the experience just how fantastically ridiculous the CD-ROM was to PC gaming when it first occurred. Games originally designed to be distributed in increments of 4 to 6 were suddenly being given over to increments of 600. Doom, in its original incarnation, lived on 6 floppy disks and could be transported in the amount of data it takes now to load the web page of a single tweet. There were 2 ecosystems of technology at the time, and it wasn't as simple as more space means more big games. For a few years there, games were being made to try and exist in both technological spaces, the disk distribution and the CD-ROM distribution, with bulletin boards and early internet being more geared towards the former than the latter. You'd see illegal download websites proudly touting that they had stripped versions of CD-ROM games with all the audio and video removed, making the game that remained something like 20 megabytes. In the early days of the CD-ROM then, there were companies that, a little unscrupulously really, were collecting as many shareware or widely distributed titles as they could possibly find, compiling them into 600 megabyte collections of games originally designed to fill 1 or 2 megabytes, sometimes with nothing but a text menu to show you hundreds of completely indistinguishable games from one another, and then sell them to you. You could spend $15 and get a CD of shareware that really was ostensibly free to copy from someone, but then you'd have to go and find all of it. That was part of the trick when it came to shareware CDs. They gave you a few hundred things to play, but be honest, if it was on the third page of possible directories when you typed dir/p, then you probably weren't going to go looking in that directory. They were garbage. The AOL free CD trial of the PC Gamer set, with everyone having 1 or 2 of them and the task of looking through them being genuinely difficult. Sometimes a blood-stained demon asks me why I seem to know all the DOS shareware garbage from this period, and I tell her, please, sheath your blade when you ask questions like that, but also, it's because I had free time as a church boy. That's how I found all these shareware games, these free games, and the rare gem of a whole game that was sometimes just randomly, accidentally being pirated and nobody noticed or cared. Crystal Caves, Sam the Secret Agent, Scunny Cart. One of those games, one of the good ones, was Traffic Department 2192, a project who had a 12-year-old working as a composer and which had presented its shareware chapter a range of about 20 levels and thousands upon thousands of words. See, I learned from the best. At its least sophisticated, Traffic Department 2192 is a top-down shooter where you pilot a skiddy little spaceship vehicle around a city with surfaces you can bump into without causing any harm to your vessel, and then shoot at other vessels that are doing the same thing. Set at first on the desert planet of Seich, in a city torn between a number of factions, it's very much a game ahead of its time in that it presents you with the same large map over and over and sends you to waypoints around it, with just a point for the direction you should go in, and a mini-map to guide you. It's not a bad gameplay loop either, where you go out, do some mission-y things of protecting a truck, or blowing up a truck, or hunting down a specific enemy ship, or protecting another specific enemy ship, and... yeah, okay, that is almost it. The game only has a few actual options for how you engage with the levels. Go to a space, attack a thing, or chase down a thing, or pick up a thing. You're not damaged by hitting walls, and enemies are largely pretty stupid, mostly hard to kill as they move around seemingly at random, and they don't pose an enormous amount of threat to you until you let them mob you up. There are 3 to 4 different kinds of ships you fly, and they are largely interchangeable. 1 or 2 of them are clearly better than the others, but you never get to make any kind of choices about them. It's just a way that the levels vary one to another. The only difference between the Hornet and the Stiletto is just whether or not pressing the insert button on your keyboard does anything. The gameplay itself is... well, it's fine. It's fine. When you get a game this long as a shareware game, you play it a lot, even if the gameplay isn't particularly compelling. The thing is, if you go looking, you're going to find that the people who remember this game really love it, and remember it in many cases really fondly. This is the first time I've ever found fan Lego for a thing before I found fan art. What made this game so compelling? What made it so strangely sticky in the memory of a generation of 8-year-olds bored enough to search all the way to the T section on an unguided archive disc of CD-ROMs that sold games by volume? For me, it was the story. And boy, that story, it gets dark. This game was one of the first games I ever played with a content warning. The game opens with a screen warning you that the script has adult material in it, and you can choose to use an adult version of it, or a safe version. This right here was the kind of thing that blew my mind, because the game can't check, can it? If I, a child, played this game, no one was going to, get me in trouble, right? Right? I played the Shareware version of the game all the way through a few times with the safe script, reading and rereading it every time, as the story presented itself with a sort of cinematic direction we'd later come to think of as a kinetic novel style. You'd get scene-setting images showing you the location you were in, then a black background with portraits appearing and disappearing to show who arrived and left, and text direction took care of the rest. The story follows our protagonist, Lieutenant Marta Velasquez, a hotshot traffic department skiff pilot with a chip on her shoulder, no desire to work with a partner, and a bad attitude. And what follows is the kind of sprawling, preposterous storytelling epic you get when dealing with someone who doesn't have an editor doing oversight and can do almost endless quantities of script writing showing dialogue between 2 or 3 characters. The story shows you almost nothing, and instead presents you every kind of storytelling hook and scene you can get when the only way to present it is 2 characters talking. Do you like Top Gun? Well, I hadn't seen it when I saw this, so I didn't realize that I was getting a crash course, in Top Gun. Do you like evil clone stories? Do you like races against time? Moral dilemmas about cybernetics? Rowboat fucking? Dead partners? Cops on the edge? Cops that go bad? Cops that were always bad? Colony drops? Alien invasions? Resource struggles? Chief, who's sick of you stepping over the line this time? It's what would sometimes be called a cliché storm, but that is itself a cliché, so dang it if I'm not a guilty party too. It's just so long. There's so much stuff in this Shareware game's part 1 of 4, and all of that stuff ramps up in the remaining chapters. It's not a story that feels foreshadowed as much as the whole narrative was built a piece at a time in a single running first draft, like Gromit laying track out in front of the speeding train. And the simplicity of the whole thing means that as the story winds up needing just more and more excuses to put you in the utter asshole villain you're playing, Velasquez. Oh, if you played the Shareware version and thought, well, she gets better in the later chapters, I have some bad news for you. Vel starts out an awful asshole, and the closest she gets to not being an asshole is when she has a hole blown in her memory by evil enemy brainwashing. That's when they substitute in the story beat of her as a traumatized wandering person struggling with phantom memories, and the feeling that a chunk of her personality is missing because of something she can't quite remember. There's some thematic stuff too, like how Vel is clearly meant to represent the "my father was murdered" creates a trauma that makes you into a total dick who murders people, which I'm not wild about, but it was early 90s. It was somehow trying to be a sci-fi epic and an edgy story about a loose cannon cop, and everything else the writer put together at the same time. Plus, now, a cop with a paper-thin excuse for killing a bunch of people doesn't seem so far-fetched. There's 2 other interesting threads of history here with Traffic Department 2192. It's not just that the game was an interesting gem of intersecting game types and technological distribution, it's also the people involved. Traffic Department 2192 was made by a lot of younger programmers and designers and writers as a sort of early project to make video games professionally. It was vast enough to be showing a lot of effort and unchallenging enough to be a project from a tiny team back in the day. Firstly, the story of this beast of a game, this visual novel with levels between it, was the work of one Chris Perkins. That's a name that's quite generic, so it was for a time uncertain if it meant the D&D Chris Perkins, who, if you Google him now, will show a lot of interviews about different levels of work and development of the best-known tabletop RPG in the English-speaking world. One of the other people involved in the game was a 13-year-old composer who nowadays goes by the name Owen Pallett. Pallett was a trained violinist as a child, and grew up to do more training, and then didn't seem to do much more training because there was all the albums they were releasing and getting awards for. Most notably recently, Pallett was nominated for an Oscar for composing music for the Joaquin Phoenix X His Alexa vehicle, Her. Traffic Department 2192 is available to play online, and you can go play it in your browser even. It's not a big game, but it was a really interesting one. Revisiting games like this can be a reminder that the early 90s were a really surreally different time. Interfaces weren't standardized, markets weren't calcified, games weren't the project of millions of dollars, and you couldn't even be sure about what kinds of computers you'd be getting played on. Would you get these days a shooting city explorer mission-based game with a mostly linear plot, conveyed by thousands of words? The idea of making a fully voiced version of this game just makes my brain melt in terms of the time spent recording voice lines. But isn't it amazing to have what amounts to a book, but it's a script, and therefore more in common with the storytelling of a play, and this is used to tell the story of a traumatized trafficked cyborg post-apocalyptic cop on the edge with lasers before the alien colony drop happens? You could probably find all sorts of game word sayers talking about how this is bad design. You could find people who would complain that the story of this game is too long, didn't read. But you couldn't make this game with this story in any other way. You can't have a genuinely sprawling epic like this without fundamentally making it a different kind of game, and the fact that there's no space for a game like this in the mind space of how games should be makes me wonder about how many games are being made that want to do or try things that are instead being choked out of existence by a mindset that you shouldn't do games this way, because some YouTubesman has convinced indie creators that, hey, you're doing it wrong, stop, you're creating ludonarrative dissonance. This isn't good design. You might just be making a game that sings in the mind of its actual fans for 30 years by doing something wrong. I still remember, say,